A family woke up in Pacifica, California, and their backyard was just gone. Not damaged. Not eroded a little bit. Gone. 150 meters of cliff face collapsed into the Pacific Ocean overnight, taking with it hiking trails, parking lots, and coming within 20 feet of occupied homes. The footage looks like something out of a disaster movie. Except this is real. It happened in January 2026, and it's not even the first time. So what's causing entire sections of the California coast to just disappear? Stick around, because the answer is way more complicated than you think. Let's get one thing straight right off the bat. It's been happening for millions of years. The ocean crashes against land, breaks it down, carries it away. Cliffs retreat inland over time. This is basic geology. But here's what's not normal. The speed at which California's coastline is disappearing has accelerated dramatically in the past 5 years. And 2025 to 2026 has been absolutely devastating. The Pacifica incident happened on January 18, 2026. Around 3 a.m. local time, a massive section of cliff between Esplanade Avenue and Beach Boulevard just let go. We're not talking about some rocks falling. This was a catastrophic failure. 150 meters of coastline, roughly 500 feet, collapsed in a matter of minutes. The sound woke up half the neighborhood. People described it as thunder, or an explosion, or the earth itself screaming. When the sun came up and people could actually see what happened, the scale was incomprehensible. Where there had been a cliff edge with a walking path, there was now just air. The cliff face had sheared off vertically. Looking at it from the side, you could see the layers of rock and soil exposed, like someone had taken a knife to a layer cake. At the bottom, a mountain of debris, probably 50,000 tons of earth and rock, spread out into the ocean. But here's what made this particular collapse so terrifying. The crack. After the initial collapse, geologists surveyed the area and found a massive fissure running parallel to the new cliff edge. This crack, in some places over a foot wide, suggested that more land was about to go. They evacuated 7 homes immediately. Not because they'd been damaged, but because they were sitting on a section of cliff that could collapse at any moment. And it did. 3 days later, on January 21st, another section went, smaller this time, only about 30 meters. But it took with it a portion of Esplanade Avenue itself. The road just ended in midair now. City crews had to put up concrete barriers to stop cars from driving off the cliff. Yeah, because apparently people need physical barriers to not drive into the ocean. Now you might be thinking, okay, this is Pacifica. And you'd be right. Pacifica has been dealing with coastal erosion for decades. But the rate has changed. Data from the United States Geological Survey shows that between 1950 and 2000, that section of coast was eroding at about 0.3 meters per year. Manageable, predictable. Between 2000 and 2020, it increased to about 0.8 meters per year. Concerning, but not catastrophic. But since 2020, the rate has exploded. Some sections are losing 2 to 3 meters per year, and that's the average. During major storm events, like what happened in January 2026, you get these massive collapse events that reset everything. One night erases decades of slow erosion. So what changed? Why is this happening now? The easy answer is climate change, and that's part of it. But it's not the whole story. Let's break down the factors. First, sea level rise. The Pacific Ocean along the California coast has risen about 9 inches since 1900. That doesn't sound like much. 9 inches. Who cares? But here's the thing. It's not just about the water being higher. It's about where that water reaches. That extra 9 inches means waves are hitting parts of the cliff that haven't been hit by waves in hundreds of years. Rock and soil that were stable above the high tide line are now getting pounded by surf. They're not adapted for it. They're not consolidated. They erode fast. And sea level rise is accelerating. In the last 10 years alone, the California coast has seen about 3 inches of rise. That's a third of the total rise from the last century happening in just 1 decade. By 2050, projections suggest another 10 to 18 inches. Depending on which model you believe, anywhere from 2 to 6 feet. But sea level rise alone doesn't explain what happened in Pacifica. That brings us to the storms. The 2025 to 2026 winter season has been brutal for California. A series of atmospheric rivers, Those massive plumes of moisture that come off the Pacific have been slamming into the coast non-stop since November. These aren't normal rain events. An atmospheric river can dump as much water as 25 Mississippi rivers per day. When that much water falls on already saturated ground, bad things happen. The soil becomes waterlogged. It gets heavy. It loses cohesion. And when it's sitting on the edge of a cliff above the ocean, it wants to slide. Add in the fact that waves are undercutting the base of the cliff, removing support from below, and you've got a recipe for massive collapses. The storm that hit on January 17th, the night before the Pacifica collapse, was a monster. Sustained winds of 60 miles per hour, gusts over 90, wave heights of 25 to 30 feet, over 5 inches of rain in 24 hours. The ground was already saturated from previous storms. This one was just the tipping point. Literally. Groundwater. California's aquifers are being depleted. People are pumping water out of the ground faster than it's being replenished. When you remove groundwater, the soil compacts. It settles. This creates stress fractures, especially in areas that are already geologically unstable, like coastal cliffs. There's also the type of rock we're dealing with. Much of the California coast, especially around Pacifica, is made up of sedimentary rock, shale, mudstone. These rocks are relatively soft. They're formed from compressed sediment, and they're layered. Water gets between the layers, acts as a lubricant, and the layers slide apart. It's like a stack of wet papers. Eventually, it's going to collapse. Some areas are worse than others. The cliffs around Pacifica are made up of something called the Merced Formation. It's a mix of sandstone, mudstone, and conglomerate that's only about 2 to 10 million years old. In geological terms, that's young. It hasn't had time to fully consolidate and harden. It's weak, and it's sitting right on the coast, getting pounded by the Pacific Ocean. Now let's talk about the human element. Because here's where it gets frustrating. This isn't a surprise. Scientists have been warning about this for years. Decades, actually. The California Coastal Commission has been publishing reports about erosion risk since the 1980s. They have maps showing which areas are at high risk, which areas are going to lose significant land in the next 20 to 50 years. But people keep building there. Why? Because it's the California coast. The views are incredible. The property values are insane. A house with an ocean view in Pacifica can sell for over $2 million. And people convince themselves that it won't happen to them. The cliff won't collapse. The erosion will stop. Technology will solve it. Something. There's also a lot of denial about the time frame. When scientists say a section of coast will erode significantly in the next 50 years, people hear 50 years from now and think they'll be long gone by then. Why worry about a problem that's 5 decades away? Except it's not 50 years anymore. The accelerated erosion means what was projected for 2050 is happening in 2026. Some homeowners have tried to fight the erosion with engineering solutions. Seawalls, riprap, reinforced concrete structures. But they're expensive. A seawall for a single property can cost $500,000 to over $1 million. And they don't last forever. The ocean is relentless. It finds weaknesses. It gets around barriers. It undermines foundations. There's also the problem of downstream effects. When you build a seawall to protect your property, you're changing how waves interact with the coast. The energy that would have been absorbed by eroding your cliff now gets redirected. It hits the cliffs on either side of your wall with more force. Your neighbors start experiencing accelerated erosion. It creates conflict, legal battles, community tension. The Pacifica collapse in January wasn't the first major event in the 2025 to 2026 season. It wasn't even the biggest. In December 2025, a section of coast near Big Sur collapsed, 200 meters. It took out a portion of Highway 1, the iconic coastal highway. The road was closed for weeks while crews figured out how to reroute traffic. The detour added 3 hours to the drive between Los Angeles and San Francisco. In November 2025, Capitola Wharf, a historic pier in Santa Cruz County, partially collapsed during a storm. Large sections of the wharf broke off and floated away. The imagery was surreal. You had pieces of a pier, with railings and lampposts still attached, drifting in the surf like broken toys. Down in Southern California, Newport Beach has been dealing with major erosion. Sections of beach that were 50 meters wide in the 1990s are now less than 10 meters wide. During high tide, there's barely any beach at all, trucking in sand to replace what the ocean takes. But it's temporary. The sand gets washed away during the next big storm, and they have to do it all over again. San Diego County has similar problems. The cliffs in Del Mar, Solana Beach, and Encinitas are eroding rapidly. There have been multiple collapses in the past year. The cliff gave no warning. It just let go. One second, there was a family enjoying the beach. The next second, they were buried under tons of rock and earth. That incident led to increased restrictions on beach access along much of the San Diego coast. Beaches that used to be open year-round now have sections that are closed during winter months when erosion risk is highest. This has created pushback from residents and tourists who feel they're being denied access to public beaches. But the alternative is more deaths. The economic impact of coastal erosion in California is staggering. A 2024 study estimated that the state could lose $8 to $10 billion in property value by 2050 due to erosion and sea level rise. And that estimate was made before the 2025 to 2026 winter showed just how bad things could get. The real number might be much higher. There's also the infrastructure cost. Roads, utilities, public facilities, all of this has to be relocated as the coast retreats. Highway 1, which runs along much of the California coast, is going to need major realignment in multiple locations. Each realignment costs tens of millions of dollars. The state has a backlog of coastal erosion projects that would cost over $1 billion to address. The money isn't there. Insurance companies are starting to pull out of coastal areas. Homeowners insurance in high-risk erosion zones is becoming unavailable or prohibitively expensive. Some companies have stopped offering new policies altogether. If you can't get insurance, you can't get a mortgage. If you can't get a mortgage, property values crash. It's a cascading failure. Local governments are in a bind. They don't have the resources to protect every property. They can't afford to buy out everyone in high-risk areas. They can't afford to build massive seawalls along the entire coast. But they also can't just abandon communities. So they're stuck making difficult decisions about who gets protection and who doesn't. There's increasing talk about managed retreat. That's the technical term for moving buildings and infrastructure inland before erosion takes them. It's controversial because it means giving up land to the ocean. It means accepting that some areas can't be saved, but it's probably the only realistic long-term solution. Some communities are already implementing managed retreat strategies. The city of Pacifica has a long-term plan that involves relocating critical infrastructure and allowing some areas to erode naturally. It's not popular with residents who own property in those areas. But the alternative is watching their homes fall into the ocean. Let's talk about what the future looks like. Because the erosion we're seeing now is going to get worse. Sea levels are going to continue rising. Storms are projected to become more intense. The combination means more collapses, more property loss, more economic damage. By 2050, models suggest that California could lose anywhere from 500 to 1,500 meters of coastline in vulnerable areas. That's not total. That's per vulnerable section. Some areas will lose more, some less, depending on geology and wave exposure. The state is looking at a significant reshaping of its coast. Iconic landmarks are at risk. The Cliff House in San Francisco, a historic building that's been around since 1863, is threatened. Sections of Big Sur that attract millions of tourists every year might become inaccessible. Beach communities that define California's coastal culture could cease to exist. There's also the ecological impact. Coastal ecosystems, wetlands, tide pools, all of this is being disrupted by accelerated erosion. Species that depend on specific coastal conditions are losing habitat. Some will adapt, some will relocate, some will go extinct. The California coast is one of the most biodiverse marine ecosystems in the world. What happens to it affects the entire Pacific. Now here's something that might surprise you. Not all erosion is bad. From a purely geological perspective, erosion is natural and necessary. It's how coasts evolve. It's how sediment gets transported from one place to another. The problem is, when human development gets in the way. If there were no buildings, no roads, no infrastructure on the California coast, erosion wouldn't be a crisis. It would just be nature doing its thing. The cliffs would retreat, the beaches would change shape, and life would adapt. But we've built trillion-dollar cities on the edge of a dynamic, changing coast. We've treated the coastline as if it's permanent when it's fundamentally temporary. Some scientists argue that the real problem isn't erosion. The real problem is our refusal to accept that coasts move. We've built entire cities based on the assumption that the shoreline will stay where it is. When it doesn't, we're shocked. We call it a disaster. But it's not a disaster for the ocean. It's only a disaster for us. There's a philosophical question buried in all of this. Do we have the right to stop coastal erosion? Should we spend billions trying to hold back the ocean? Or should we accept that some land is going to be lost and plan accordingly? Different people have different answers, and those answers often depend on whether your house is about to fall into the ocean. The technology exists to protect coastlines. They've built elaborate systems of dikes, barriers, and pumps. It works, but it costs enormous amounts of money and requires constant maintenance. And the Netherlands is a small, flat country with a centralized government and a population that's unified around the need to control water. California is a massive state with diverse geography, fractured governance, and no consensus on how to handle coastal issues. Some experimental solutions are being tried. Living shorelines, which use vegetation and natural materials to absorb wave energy. Artificial reefs that reduce wave impact on the coast. Beach nourishment using sediment from dredging projects. Managed realignment where seawalls are moved inland to create new intertidal habitats. All of these have merit, but they're expensive, they're unproven at large scale, and they require long-term commitment. The Pacifica collapse is going to be studied for years. Geologists, engineers, climate scientists, they're all going to analyze what happened, why it happened, and what it tells us about the future. But the residents who lost their homes, who watched their property disappear overnight, they don't need studies. They need solutions. Those solutions don't exist. The footage from Pacifica is haunting. Drone video shows the scale of the collapse. You can see furniture sticking out of the cliff face where homes used to be. You can see cars that were in driveways now perched on the edge of a vertical drop. There's a swing set, still intact, hanging off the edge of the cliff. Some kid's backyard is now 150 meters closer to the ocean. Local news interviewed residents who were evacuated. One woman said she'd lived in her house for 40 years. She raised her kids there. She never thought she'd have to leave. Another resident, a younger guy who just bought his house 2 years ago, talked about how he'd lost his entire investment. The house is still standing, but it's worthless. You can't sell a house that might fall into the ocean next week. The bank still wants the mortgage paid, but insurance won't cover erosion. He's financially ruined. There's anger in these communities. Anger at local government for allowing development in high-risk areas. Anger at climate change for accelerating the erosion. Anger at the ocean itself for not staying where it's supposed to be. But underneath the anger is fear. Because if it happened in Pacifica, it can happen anywhere along the coast. Your neighborhood could be next. The January 2026 collapses have sparked renewed debate about coastal policy in California. Some legislators are pushing for stricter building codes in erosion zones. Others want more funding for coastal protection. Environmental groups are arguing for managed retreat and restoration of natural shorelines. Property rights advocates are fighting against any restrictions on coastal development. It's messy, it's political, and it's urgent. Whether this is happening, that argument is over. The footage from Pacifica, from Big Sur, from Capitola, from all along the coast, it's undeniable. The California coast is disappearing. The only question is how fast and what we're going to do about it. The next big storm is coming. Weather models show another atmospheric river system developing in the Pacific, expected to hit California in early February. Residents in high-risk areas are evacuating preemptively. Everyone is watching the cliffs, waiting to see what happens next. This is the new normal for California. Not occasional erosion events, but constant, relentless loss of land. The Golden State's coastline,